those of you that don't know the oral assessment within Brightpath, it's an assessment that has been used for a long time with speech pathologists, and then we've adapted it for teachers to use. The students are given these beautiful little wordless picture books, and they tell the story to you, and you record them and then analyse their story. We looked long and hard for an Australian picture book that had the same strong narrative and couldn't. This has a slight American feel. Now, on the Brightpath scale, the lowest performance, the child saying something like the dog doing that, the frog getting in, gone, opening the window, the dog's putting his head in that. Further up the continuum, the student starting to say things like, once upon a time there was a boy who wanted to catch a frog, but when he catched the frog he falled. And then our top performing student on this ruler, one day a boy wanted a pet frog, so he and his dog Rover went out to get a frog. The boy tried to look for a frog as high as he could, whilst Rover scratched himself all over. So you can see the huge range of ability that's represented on the scale. So last year we invited 4 schools to participate in the study, and they tested their kids using the Brightpath oral narrative. And then every school had a 5-month intervention, and then they tested their students 5 months later. Now this afternoon we're going to have quite a deep debate and discussion about effect sizes. But these are the effect sizes that we got. So if you concentrate on the 12 months one, typically we're told that an effect size of about 0.4 represents a year's growth. So what you can see here is that we had phenomenal growth in these schools. Now I should say that school 1, they already started much higher, so it was going to be harder for them to show growth. And our panel representatives were all involved in this, and they're going to now take us through some of the work. But I'll cross over to Rosemary, who's going to tell us a little bit more about oral narratives.
So why do children need to tell stories? Well, first and foremost, I mean, oral narrative is very much a social skill. It's a social communication strategy. And you just think of yourselves every day in schools, at the shops, ringing people up on the phone. You're always engaging in oral narratives. So first and foremost, I mean, that's the thing about oral narrative. If you don't have those skills, it's going to become a real social difficulty for you. But I think as educators, we also need to be really aware of the significance of oral narrative development on academic achievement and outcomes, and the research is really clear in that. And I totally agree with Raywin's focus on teachers reading stories and how important it is. But I think we also need to acknowledge that a lot of children come to our schools with very poorly developed oral language skills. And so regardless of the number of stories we read them, they're still not going to be able to understand the intricacies of those stories. And so for a lot of children, we really need to be able to teach them the sort of structures of those skills. So when we think about what the oral narrative ruler measures, it looks at the ability of a child to tell a story, how they're able to sequence and make their ideas cohesive. What about the length of the sentences that they use? It has a look at them, and what the variety of the beginnings that they use. The grammatical structure, with a particular focus also on tense. The vocabulary and the descriptive language that they use, because of course, as Raywin pointed out to us, that's a really important part of being able to make stories interesting to the readers. And apart from all of those things, apart from articulation, which of course is very much a speech pathologist's role, and we need to be very careful when we intervene in those sorts of areas, because as educators we don't really have the skills to know how to intervene with articulation. But all of those skills, once they've been identified with the ruler, we can teach them and make a big difference. So what do we know about oral narrative and what the narrative skills support? Well, we know that those skills really support comprehension. So children with good oral narrative skills start to understand sequencing and the importance of that in comprehending. It helps them to understand the questions that often get directed to them, in schools. And then, of course, the answering of questions then leads to the development of higher skills such as inferencing and predicting. And then, of course, the understanding helps us then to develop the expressive skills. So children can engage in retelling stories, imitating, and then generating, as Steve got up and did a bit of generating of a story himself at the end of Rowan's session. So let's have a look at the broad features of an oral narrative. So first of all, we've got the macro structure and the micro structure. The macro structure consists of the three broad areas, which once again Rawan introduced us to, and you'd all know about, which is the beginning, the middle, and the end. The beginning, of course, includes the setting, so the where, and also the place. The setting, which is the place, so that's the where, and then, of course, the when as well. Now, the when can include all sorts of things like, it could have been a long, long time ago, it could have been yesterday, it could have been at 2 o'clock, it could have been last year, it could have been in autumn. So there's all sorts of things that come into the actual setting. We've also got the character, or the who, and the main character in the story, of course, is the one that's involved in the central plot, or at the Language Development Centre, as we call it, the critical triangle, and the resolution. Secondary characters can also be included in the story. Then in the middle of the story, we've got the initiating event. So that's often a problem. And, it all links exactly to what Raymond was talking to us about this morning in terms of story writing. And it really sets the stage for the rest of the narrative and the series of events that follow. Then there's an internal response, which is reaction, or the emotion of the character and how they feel because of the initiating event. And then the plan, which refers to what the character is going to do to achieve the goal in response to that initiating event and the emotional response that the character had to the event. And then we've got the action, or the attempts, which is a series of events where the character attempts to solve the problem. And at this point, there's the teller of the story needs to have lots of conjunctions and connectors in order to demonstrate, the temporal and causal relationships that are going on in the story. Now, some stories have also got a complicating event, and they can actually change the whole course of the story. And that usually results in another critical triangle where the character has some sort of internal response and generates a new plan. And then, of course, we've got the ending to the story, which is the solution or the resolution. And that's the final event where the problem's solved. And then there's a conclusion or a consequence, and that's, of course, the end of the story. So it's quite a complex structure when you look at it in terms of a true narrative. So it's not surprising that children with sort of low language skills find it quite difficult to piece together an oral story. On top of that, we've got the whole microstructure level. So that's in terms of like the sentence types and lengths. Are they able to use complex sentences, or are they still quite simple? And then what about connectors? Temporal connectors and causal connectors. A lot of kids have great difficulty with the causal connectors. Things such as using because and so and thus and therefore. And then there's verbs. So we've got mental verbs. Now, mental verbs are something that children with language difficulties have great difficulty with. So words like felt and decided, hated, liked, disliked. As compared with the linguistic verbs, which are about communicating. So such as said, yelled, shouted, exclaimed. All those things are really important in telling and then in future writing an interesting story. A whole range of adverbials that we need to use throughout stories. Adverbials of place, time, manner. Then we've got noun phrases. So noun phrases that need to be expanded by, adding an article, a determiner, an adjective, whether in terms of tense, is it regular tense, or do we have a grasp of irregular tense? So, for example, regular, where we just add an ed to a word, or irregular, where we have a totally different word, like the boy walked or the boy ran. And then grammatical errors, really crucial in terms of being able to work on those sorts of areas. And that includes sentence level grammar errors, like incorrect order of words, missing words. Then we've got word level errors, so incorrect word structure, missing morphological markers. Sentence grammar errors, like I go to the shop yesterday. Missing words, he went up a tree. So lots of grammar that we need to think about in terms of helping to develop skills in our children. And then what are other genres that cover all of those kind of underlying skills that in oral narrative? So we've got personal recounts, which of course refer to stories that are factual and retell events that have already happened. And in classrooms, most children engage in weekend news, which is an example of that. And we've got procedures and explanations, which are both factual. Procedures like give instructions on how to make or do something, like, for example, a recipe. Explanations explain how something happens. Then we've got story retells, and they're a much more literary skill. So that's when we are able to retell events from novels, plays, films, personal experiences to entertain others. And we heard Raymond involved in a lot of that sort of stuff this morning. And story generation, telling a story using a series of events. And then we've got areas such as report, where we classify, describe and give factual information about people, animals, things or phenomena. And then exposition or persuasion, where we give reasons for a point of view and trying to convince others from it. So that's a bit of a progression of those skills and the difficulty that lies within them. So what are the benefits of teaching oral narrative? Well, it's really important to note that apart from the social importance, oral narratives are a common use means of communication that reflect academic language. The literate features used in narration, including all of those things that we talked about, are really consistent with the sorts of skills that students need to learn before progressing on to written narrative skills. So as a consequence, narrative proficiency is highly predictive of reading comprehension. Children with good oral narrative skills experience fewer academic difficulties, and there's so much research around that. Narration results in a greater use of really complex utterances. So if you can engage in more narrative skills in the classroom, the children are going to need and try to develop more complex language skills. It also, narrative intervention promotes a very explicit focus on specific complex language targets. So narrative is such a great sort of medium for teaching a whole range of language skills. And of course we know that everyday social interactions are enhanced by good narrative skills. And I think it is so important to acknowledge that research has indicated that young school-age children with and without language impairment can greatly improve their ability to understand and produce story grammar in specific contexts way beyond traditional developmental expectations through the explicit narrative language intervention. And that's recent research in 2012. We've had recent feedback in the work that I do from schools from very low socioeconomic areas that where we've been working with them. They've been using the Brightpath oral narrative ruler. Then they've been engaging in sort of professional development through WAPA with Katrina Benetti and really focusing on narrative. and they have now for the first time found a big improvement in their writing NAPLAN results, and they have taken it all back to the recognition that they really started working on oral narrative before moving on to written narrative. Thank you, Sandy.
Okay, my name's Debbie Bolton. I'm the Deputy Head at Carmel School, and my job today is to talk to you about pedagogy and what you can do to enhance oral language at your school, and why Brightpath sits very comfortably for us as an assessment tool because of our focus on oral language. It's incredibly steeped in our pedagogy. We use a combination of inquiry and Walker learning, and dare I say, play from K to 2. So we actively encourage play within our students. We dedicate time right up to year 2 within our classrooms to play because of all that we can achieve through that. The investigations model gives you an opportunity for your children to engage in hands-on learning. They are actively engaged in all sorts of activities. They have opportunities to describe objects and events and situations, and they specifically get to share their learning within tuning in and reflection situations. So the teacher can guide the oral language and model the oral language as well. There's a huge emphasis on oral language throughout our day, and we know that that translates very well into written language. Okay. We use dramatic play areas extensively. So we want those children to actually authentically engage in oral language, so they have the opportunity to converse and communicate. In K, it looks a little bit different to what it does in year 2. But the fact is that these children regularly get to visit and try out different vocabulary. The centres are something maybe thematic, maybe child-centred. The kids have agency in where they go and how they develop their oral language skills. They are learning from their peers, and they're also seeing teacher modelling as well. So the teachers are actively engaged in that process. They are part of the learning all of the time. They are in that dramatic play session, and they are being a character. It helps the kids to develop this idea of setting, their idea of character, their idea of defining a character. So it works really well using dramatic play. You can extend that with the use of puppets. You can extend it through the use of the iPad, where they use something like Puppet Pals. So they're really creating their own stories, but they're not having to be battened down with writing it all the time. It can be shared orally and is respected as a story orally. We use a lot of shared reading so that you can actually have the modelling that is required through books. So the children are seeing how the stories are structured. They're seeing how you can increase your vocabulary through that mode. They are using their critical and creative thinking through the comprehension tasks that go on with that. Even our pre-primaries that we don't ask them to be reading, we don't expect that they are reading, they will still go through the processes of a shared reading environment so that they are learning how they can the teacher is modelling the reading so that they are actually following along and seeing themselves as reading and viewing themselves as reading. So all that leads up into that development of the oral narrative. They're sharing all of their thoughts orally, and therefore they will grow in their vocabulary. The discussion is rich, the ideas are valued, the thinking is always visible. So the teacher will record things and the students will record when appropriate. How we've used Brightpath is, we were very firm believers on oral language. We were very firm believers on the pedagogy that leads to oral language, but we weren't actually able to pinpoint a place for each of our students and be able to work them from that place. What the oral narrative ruler gave us was examples on how we could extend those children and then place it authentically back into the play. So if we saw that children were struggling in a particular area of language development, we could then, as teachers, work individually with those students or create environments that would make that richer for them. So it was very powerful for us. The other powerful element was that we actually realised quite quickly that our kids fell in the ruler in terms of where they were developmentally. So most of our kindy children fell in the earlier parts of the ruler. Most of our year ones were falling just after them. So there wasn't a huge amount of crossover, but there was a beautiful developmental trail happening. By year 2, our children were topping out of the ruler because they had made that enormous growth because of we believe, the pedagogy that supported that, and because we were able to pinpoint the areas that needed extension. So we were seeing value add for our students in a really authentic and enhancing way for their learning. It worked incredibly well for us. We took our children's snapshot and then we looked at it again. We looked at a planning tool to enhance that learning as well. So we grouped the children in terms of where they had sat on the ruler, and we thought about the strategies within our classroom that would actually enhance the learning. So that went on to a planning tool. That planning tool was shared amongst the K-2 teachers. So if there were children that crossed over within each of the levels, we could work with them. So for us, the Brightpath oral narrative ruler and the strategies or the descriptors that were on there could feed directly back into the way that we choose to teach our children. And it didn't have to be done in a specific, explicit teaching model all of the time. There were times that was the best practice, but other times it was about creating those really rich environments that I showed you in the other slides, to make our children excited about their oral language, wanting to contribute. The Walker learning model that we use with investigations asks our children to share their learning quite on a stage, essentially. They are in front of the class and they want to be able to do that as well as they possibly can. So they are given those opportunities to create that oral language. So that's how Brightpath works for us, and how it fits in pedagogically to a really quality early years program.
We're just going to talk about quickly our involvement with Brightpath. Prior to the project, we seemed to think we were actually doing okay in oral language. It wasn't explicitly developed in our scope and sequence. Now, we've got an English scope and sequence, goes through every area of the English curriculum. It looks at every year level. It looks term by term. It sort of breaks down the curriculum. Unfortunately, oral language was missing. We seemed to think that it was being taught implicitly through news telling, through class discussions, through speech development, and just through their general class presentations.
So my part was that when we got the kindy and the prep class together, and we used the Easy Speak microphone, and we used the book that Dr. Sandy was talking about, we found that mostly our oral narratives lacked structure. There was no surprise there. Most children would just basically elaborate on what they saw on the pictures, which is what one of our first speakers has said. There was there wasn't any cohesion, some character use with some of them, but really quite simplistic. There wasn't a story that went through. Each picture seemed to be a new story to them. Mixed tenses, pronouns were mixed up, and so on. You're probably thinking, gee, they didn't do much, but they did. But on the whole, as a group, once we plotted them, we found out there were definitely these holes, and the holes is what we wanted to use Brightpath to help us plug up.
So we became involved in 2015 in the pilot program. I have to say the results when we did plot the children were a bit of a surprise, and we had to kind of get our act together fairly quickly, we thought. So we sat down as a group, the early childhood team, and we decided to have an intensive program for the next term. So it was very much an early childhood setting in that we chose fairy tales as the context, and each week we would focus on a different area of the oral narrative, whether it was the structure, whether it was just simply how you begin an oral narrative, whether it's a fairy tale or maybe it's a modern narrative, the kind of language that you need to use. We spent some time on rich language use, lists of adjectives. We looked at connectors to make sentences interesting, from short, simple sentences to more involved, complex and compound sentences. We did it in very much the early childhood setting, of course, so a mat session using a big book. And then we would split up into groups, and this was a fantastic time, actually. We had 4 adults with each class, and each of those activities was basically an opportunity to retell the story again, but it was using puppets, stick puppets, sequencing cards, dramatic play through masks, and at the end of that time, we, the following term actually, the beginning of the following term, we retested the children.
About halfway through the project, we could see a change in the way children presented their oral observations in science, in history, morning news, basically the way that they were speaking, they stood up taller, etc. Our results were very pleasing. We weren't surprised, but under the John Hattie Visible Learning, which we are a visible learning school, we could see that our effect size over 6 months was, as you can see, 1.08, well above the magic number of 0.4, which is where the actual activity has had an impact. So you don't really want to spend time and effort on things that aren't going to have maximum impact. Extrapolated over 12 months, it became 2.15, which was quite high. When we met back as a group, as a pilot group, Dr. Sandy did say that the increase was that big that it could not just be attributed to developmental progress. I noticed the girls, they would be able to pick up a textless picture book, because I'd have a lot. Where's our author? I've got a library in my room too. And the textless picture books they'd pick up, and they would actually beautifully model a cohesive, plausible story. They would choose to do that during their play investigations. They would choose to use the props that Marilyn and the team put together. The next minute you'd see the blocks coming out, etc. They would put it all into the play. They would be the character over and over and over again.
So how has this shaped our program? Well, it's changed our whole focus in prep and actually in year 1 and going into year 2 as well. So it's now a term 1 focus in prep, the oral narrative. It's developed through the whole year in kindergarten, and we are explicitly teaching the structures of oral narrative over that first term. Now, there's been some interesting developments, and we can't actually say whether they are attributed to Brightpath, but there's something that's definitely new happening in the school, and that is the way that the writing's happening in prep is quite outstanding. At the end of that first term, we had explicit writing time, and we found that the girls thought of themselves as writers. I don't know how many of you are from an early childhood classroom, but you know, when you've got 10 girls or 10 children, and you listen to the first story and the first sentence, and you know they are supposed to start, and then you whiz off to number 2, and you work your way around the table, and you come back to number 1, who's written I, looking at their picture, forgotten what they were going to say. And, sometimes you just think, oh, dear Lord, there must be a better way to earn a living here. What are we going to do here? What we have found is that something has happened with these girls. They're able to hold that sentence or that story in their head. So I've had the most wonderful experience with a group of 10 just last week where the first child said her sentence, whizzed on to the next one. By the time I came back, that first child was well into that first sentence and ready to start sentence number 2. Now, that hasn't really happened quite as dramatically before. Their sentences, their work was very different from the child next door. Because in the past, someone would say something out loud, I liked it when. The next person, hello, I liked it when. Oh, number 3, I liked it when. These were really quite different. So we've had a real development in their writing ability. This has also changed our focus with what we do in Year 1. We have kind of scaled things back from a genre focus in Year 1, and we are now, as of 2017, going to focus more on their sentence development, making sure that they have that really rich vocabulary so that those sentences can become powerful paragraphs and build up to good genre writing.
So at PC, other than the oral narrative that we've been involved with, from Year 1 to Year 6 we use the rulers for mapping genre writing. In Year 3 currently our teacher is gathering evidence for the history ruler, which we're very excited to wait and see. And because we, as I said, we are a visible learning school, this just dovetailed so well. We could give them explicit feedback. How do you move on? This is what you need to do, etc. We were so grateful that at the time, when we were bringing all of this into the junior school, that we met Brightpath, and as you said, as we've said, it's really made a big difference in the way that we approach oral narrative plus all the genre writing, etc. in the older years. And thank you very much for listening to our story.
I've been asked to speak specifically about one student who showed, and I dare say use the word, but phenomenal growth. Extraordinary growth, really, from a pre-testing of oral narrative to a post-assessment of oral narrative. And providing 2 examples so that you can have a look at what was presented in his pre-assessment, and then what happened after we had the intervention program. This was a before example. I've only given you snippets from what this child was saying. A boy, and it was slow and it was tedious, and you're sitting there and you're waiting, you're doing the whole class, so you've got lots to listen to. But a boy went walking with a dog. The boy climbed a tree. The boy was trying to, he was wanting to catch a fish, and the frog was on the log. And it went on like that. It was a page-by-page description of what was happening in the pictures. There was a very little understanding of the whole narrative, what was actually going to happen in the story. Just to go back, we used the same books as what Sandy showed at the beginning, and so there were textless books, and they provided the structure for the narrative. The student did state that it was a boy, a dog, and a frog, but other students didn't. They were using the pronouns. He did this, she did that, it did whatever. And so the story, the listener had no idea as to what the child was saying or talking about. We placed the students' oral narratives on the Brightpath ruler, and using the Brightpath ruler and the teaching points that go with the Brightpath ruler, we were able to determine what was needed in the intervention program, and for us it was lots. I'm just going to briefly go through the intervention program for any early year childhood teachers out there wanting to know how to actually do something like it. We were obviously given 5 months, but for any childhood teacher knows that we're always pushed for time. We did it over a 5-week period, and I should say we, it was me. The week one was setting. We talked about the time and the place, and we used great words to describe the settings. I've just started the intervention again this year. We do paintings. We talk about the settings from books and literature, the literature that we're showing. We do paintings. We involve all the other curriculum areas. And then we talk about great words we can use. So we're bringing lots of curriculum areas together. Week two was a focus on characters. The main characters, the supporting characters, what are they feeling? Who are they? Not he, it, the dog. And we also discussed their thoughts and their feelings, and you'll see that comes through in the next one as well. The complication we focused on week three. We didn't do this in isolation. We did talk about it as we went along, so that the students had an idea of what actually constituted a good narrative, but this was the focus for these particular weeks. The cause and effect, the characters' feelings and thoughts, again, and we have a problem and we need to solve it. I'm talking about 5 and 6 year olds, so bear with me with the language that I use. Week four, resolution and ending, the thoughts and the feelings of the characters again. How is the problem solved? How does it end? And what's the atmosphere there? And I apologise for the blip in spelling there, practice. It gave me nightmares last night when I reread it. I think the American spell check got in there. Practice storytelling. We retold stories. Anyone that would listen, we retold to our partner, we retold in groups. Anyone that came into the room, we grabbed them. And we told lots and lots of stories, using textless books, using sequence cards, using just retelling stories like Cinderella. So really anyone who would listen, we retold stories to. This is the result of the after the intervention program. I gave you the example before. Now we're getting, same student. One night there was a boy and a dog. They were looking at their pet frog until their mum told them to go to sleep. Mum's nowhere in the picture. He's brought that in. A bit further on, the dog's actually sitting on a ledge here. The boy looked a bit scared. He thought the dog would hurt himself. Feelings. We're getting that coming through in the story. Also look at the length of the sentences. A little bit further on, and this is the part that blew me away. They kept looking. They never gave up. They walked and called and called. Frog, where are you? Where are you? And this is how he's telling the story. As it echoed through the mountains. Oh my God, that sent shivers through me. Still sends shivers through me. This is year one. This is a year one student. Even without the visual text, the listener could hear the story. You knew exactly what was happening in the story. And it was a cohesive narration. It was wonderful. And I would like to add a little bit here. I don't feel I can take credit for the student's wonderful vocabulary. He must have had a rich environment at home. But what it did give him, it gave him the opportunity and the vehicle to use that language. So that was a plus for us. I have included this, and only for those people who love statistics and whatever else. On the Brightpath narrative ruler, he started at 155. After the intervention, it was 300. And I know we're having a discussion later about effect sizes and the validity and everything else, but for us, it was a plus. This is for our kindergarten, pre-primary and year one. So it's not just the year ones. And there you can see the figures there for themselves. Admittedly, we thought we were going okay with oral language, but news telling is not enough. All right? I would also like to add, it was the year ones that did show the most significant growth. And I don't know the reasons for it, but I'm sure we can come up with a few. The flow-on effect. Now, it says in the book the flow-on effect for the student, but I think it was more a flow-on effect for all of us as teachers. In term 4, we did the written narrative, as one does. I still wonder whether it's appropriate for year ones. Throw that one in. But and pre-primaries. But we did. And there was a marked improvement in the quality from the group that I had before. I do know it's a different cohort, but we didn't have the oral narrative before we did that in the year before. So massive improvement in what they were providing in a written narrative. And we didn't need to teach as much, obviously, when it came to the written narrative. The students became more astute to listening to stories, and they understood quality literature. It also gave us the language to discuss and compare parts of literature, books, stories, and it gave us a common language for that discussion. But for me, one of the biggest things was the assessment of the speaking and listening. Just an aside, Rosemary spoke about the pronunciation of words. When you have a student or you're a mother or father, you actually don't hear what your child's saying or how they're saying it, you just want to know what they're saying. The same happens in the classroom. After a while you don't hear the words that are being pronounced incorrectly, that type of thing. And the one thing that you do, if you've got your headphones listening on your head, you can hear the incorrect pronunciation of sounds. I had a mum come in, I said, he's not here, listen to this. And it was a real wow moment. So you're able to use it for getting further support and for parents to understand what their children are saying. The biggest plus was, for years I've marked speaking and listening on their reports and thinking, oh well, I've listened to news telling, I've done the on-entry conversation, I've got a good understanding of what my students are saying. Ha humbug. I now have something to hang my hat on, and I'm accountable for what I'm reporting, and I can honestly say that I can go home and say, I know what I'm writing in the report is accurate, I'm relating it to the oral narrative, and I write about that in the report, and I can assess to that. So thank Brightpath for that. Thank you.
Okay, and finally I just wanted to talk about Brightpath as the bridge between teachers and speech pathologists. First of all, I'd just like to say how excited I was when I found out through WAPA that they were working closely with Sandy and developing the Brightpath ruler, because in a language development centre you often feel like you're the only people who are interested in oral language development. And when Katrina brought Sandy out to meet me at the LDC, and we had one of our senior speech pathologists who's just completed her Masters in Oral Narrative talking together, I thought, wow, we are really on the right page. I think this is absolutely fabulous. And listening to the ladies talking today about what they've found, I think we need to be reminded about the fact that the Brightpath Oral Narrative Ruler and the Writing Ruler, it reminds me of Fraser Mustard's saying, which was, no data, no problem, no action. So I think it just, collecting those samples reminds us that we do have a problem, which we often overlook unless we actually collect that data. At the Language Development Centre, we work very closely where teachers and speech pathologists collaborate together to develop evidence-based programs and deliver quality language intervention, through the curriculum. So it is no surprise to me that teachers who are often exposed initially to the Brightpath ruler often look at all these narrative samples and sort of think, well, gosh, why did we never know about this before? Well, the reason is because as teachers, we've never been trained in that. We're trained, we feel comfortable with writing, and that's why schools often move straight into writing without forgetting that crucial stage before, where we've got to develop the oral first. So what the oral narrative ruler does, it really elicits a sample that helps teachers to identify the skills at the macro level and the micro level. It provides really good information about both. And teachers can then use that information to set whole class, small group and individual goals from it. And the descriptors included provide a really good summary of the overall strengths and the abilities at each level of development. So really useful for all of that goal setting. And then then in more details in terms of macro structure, what are the children ready to start? You might have children who are very basic oral narrative skills who might be just ready to start sequencing. Or you might have some that are ready just to look at the broad areas of beginning, middle and end. So for example, at the Language Development Centre, the children at that level, we might just use resources such as 3 plastic hoops with icons in the hoops to explain to the children as visual representation that that's the beginning, the middle and the end, and get the children to tell a story using those sort of visual supports. So, and they're usually based on routines. So for example, they might step into the first hoop and it might be, I clean my teeth, next step, and I rinse my mouth, next step, and then I go to bed. So then before moving on to much more complex structures, really important to get those samples first to work out where they're at. And then as we talked about in terms of microstructure, in teaching we're often not exposed to all of those areas. We don't even sometimes know what they all mean. So taking a sample like an oral narrative really then makes us investigate. How do we teach? How do we build up these skills? And in order to do that, we need to acknowledge that we're going to need some supports from other agencies, such as speech pathologists. But the sample definitely elicits sufficient information to identify gaps in all of that microstructure so that we can then decide where we need to go and what goals to set. So what the Brightpath Oral Narrative Assessment tells teachers is, well, it really supports teacher planning by providing a very functional assessment. It's functional because it is quite easy to administer and it collects samples across a whole range of language areas. It provides information on vocabulary, on grammar, on whether they've able to be cohesive in terms of the way they put a story together. What's their sentence structure like? And it was interesting to notice the ladies at Perth College are now focusing on really working on sentence structure of probably what you'd probably previously have called a speech pathology area. It provides a very good representative sample of overall language skills and much better than ones that's modular or decontextualised. So I'm sure you've all engaged in assessments that just collect grammar, or they just look at vocabulary development, or just look at things like are they able to sequence and so on. But this provides the whole lot together, which makes it very, very accessible. So what can speech pathologists add to this information? Well, they can provide a much finer analysis of the data for macrostructure. They can look at aspects such as whether the sentence type and the length, whether it's complex, whether it's simple, is appropriate for that age level, and know when we should start engaging in intervention at a further level. They know, particularly in terms of grammar, areas that teachers don't necessarily know about, particularly in terms of developmental expectations. Sometimes we might be picking up on grammar that's actually, they might be using inappropriate grammar, but developmentally that might be quite appropriate. That's when speech pathologists can come in and really provide that additional information about where to go from there and what sort of intervention we need. And when they are developmentally inappropriate, the sorts of interventions we can provide in a classroom, just such as recasting and so on. Then they can help us to really set individual goals and then help with whole school planning. I think we don't really acknowledge how useful speech pathologists can be in helping with that whole school planning in terms of really building up on a scope and sequence of our English plans across schools. It also provides us with strategies. They provide us with strategies that support the teaching. And then listening to oral narrative samples to identify whether articulation is developmental or disordered, because quite a few articulation errors are also just developmental and don't really need intervention. And if they do need intervention, they can point us in the same direction. They can really let us know whether a child's development is just a developmental delay or whether it is disordered. And if it is disordered, point us in the right direction about what sort of intervention we should refer those children on for. So what can I do to help teachers and speech pathologists collaborate in using Brightpaths? Well, I guess providing information and contacts regarding the available supports that there are. So language outreach services. If you're in a government service, a government school, the entire state is covered with outreach services. So the school that I'm at also has an outreach service, and our service covers the northeast metro area and the whole of the wheat belt. There are 5 language development centres, and overall we cover the entire state. So if you're using Brightpath Ruler and then you would like some support about then how to teach, once you've sort of identified the areas that you need to work on, approach your outreach service and see what support they can provide for you. We can also recommend evidence-based resources that you would find useful for that sort of thing, intervention. In terms of employment at speech pathologists at school, I would strongly recommend it if you've got any input into employment in your school, but also being very careful about how you employ a speech pathologist. Because we've had involvement with a lot of schools who will just employ a speech pathologist, but they know they need one, but they don't really know what they need them for. And so what they'll do is they'll engage them in doing a whole range of assessments, and then the speech pathologist will say, "There are a lot of problems here," and then the school says, "Yeah, but we've run out of money now, so thanks very much, and we'll see what we can do." We've developed a position paper for the Education Department on the most effective use of speech pathologists in schools. So if any of you are interested in talking to me about that, I'm more than happy to discuss it with you and to provide the paper for you, regardless of whether you're private or public schools. It doesn't make any difference. Then there's access to language development centres. A lot of people ring us up and say, "Look, I'd like to come and do an observation," because through using Brightpath or other measures, we've found that we've got difficulties in oral language or written language at our school, and we would really like some sort of support on what to do about that. So contact your language development centre, and we will get you to come in, do some observations, talk to our speech pathologists about a particular area that you're interested in and that you've identified as being a problem. And I know we've got some people in the room today who we work with in their schools in that sort of area. And how to incorporate oral language into whole school literacy planning. And I know probably quite a lot of you have engaged in professional learning and so on with language development centres and their outreach services, but also through WAPA, who run some great professional development in this area and really helping schools to incorporate all of that within their whole school literacy planning. So there's lots of sort of supports out there. You just need to know where they are. So regardless of whether you're a private school or a public school, I've got my business cards here today. So if you want to grab one off me and give me a call to get me to point you in the right direction, I'm more than happy to, because I'm just really excited that oral narrative is on the table and everyone's talking oral narrative and seeing the really strong link between academic success and its development. So thanks very much.